Do you have game designer's block? Do you not know what direction to take your design in? Are you stuck trying to solve the same problem for hours, days, weeks at a time? Do you feel like you've tried everything at this point and are almost ready to give up? If that sounds like you, then hopefully this video will be useful. In this video, I want to go over some of the techniques and tricks I use to get over game designer's block, to make progress in my designs and solve problems even when I thought I couldn't. Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world in various languages. On this channel I like to talk about what it's like being a full-time game designer, what my experiences are like in the industry, and tips and tricks helping you out there starting your own designs. So yeah, getting stuck with design can be really tough, and sometimes it can feel like no matter what you try, you just can't find the solution to the problem you're having. But there are lots of ways that you can try and unblock yourself. And in this video I want to go over several different techniques you can use at different stages of the game design process. I've separated them out into things you can use at the beginning of the process, tips and tricks you can use in the middle of the process where you have an idea that's working a bit but there are still some problems, and things that you can use at the end of the process when the game is almost done and you're almost ready to pitch it, but you know it's not quite there yet. So how do you get over game designer's block at the very start of the design process? The first thing I'd say is maybe the idea you have for the game isn't good enough. This isn't to say that it's not a good idea, but maybe the idea isn't fleshed out enough, or has enough detail, or has enough features to actually spur you on to design a game for it. If that kernel of an idea doesn't have enough details or enough inspiration for you to go out and design, maybe you need to let that idea kind of nurture a little bit, grow a little bit before you try and work on it. It could be a waste of time trying to work on that idea if it's not really suggesting what game should be built around it. I'll link a previous video I made about how I select whether an idea is good or not, which you might find helpful at this point. The second trick I try often is when I'm making the first prototype for a game, is that I don't try to make all the components for the whole game, especially if it's a larger game. Sometimes I'll make just enough components to play one round or one turn of the game. So if it's a card-based game, for example, where I think I might need, say, 100 cards, I work out, well, how many cards would I need to play one round of the game? Maybe you only need 20 or 25 cards. So instead of sitting down and spending all this time trying to design 100 different cards, you only have to design 20. And even more than this, another nice trick with that is you don't even have to make all the cards different. Sometimes it's enough to make, say, 10 cards and then double or triple that to have the deck that you need. It's probably not going to matter if you draw multiple copies of the same card, and even if you do, you could just discard it and draw another card to replace it. It's a playtest after all. All of this is trying to break down that wall in your head, break down the block to make it smaller and more manageable. If you're intimidated by the weight and scope of what you have to design, tricks like this can really help break it down into a manageable chunk that you can complete. And that's important because once you complete it, then you can test it. That's the most important thing when you start out a game design. All you want to do is get to that first playtest. You want to do whatever you can to get there the quickest. Because realistically, all that work you do designing that first prototype, most likely 80 to 90% of it is going to go straight in the bin. What you might be looking for is the 10% that works. So don't spend too much time trying to make the first prototype amazing or to make everything different. Just do enough to get it to the table. And the last tip that can help at the start of the game design process is to use constraints to help you make decisions. The way I think about constraints is they're kind of like shortcuts. They're ways of making blanket rules that every time after that you come to a decision point in your design and you have a choice between A and B. Because you have this constraint, your choice might already be made for you. And at the very start of a game design process, you have so many decisions that you have to make. Am I going to use this mechanism, this mechanism? What should the text for this card mean? How many players should I have? What type of game it is? And sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed with decision fatigue of trying to work out the answers to all of these things, when realistically you don't actually know what the right answers are. By using constraints, you can just automatically answer a bunch of these questions, and then you don't have to think about them anymore. You can just go forward and again, get a prototype done. Some useful constraints can include constraining the types of components or numbers of components you're going to use. A very common one is designing an 18 card game, for example, or designing a game that only uses the 52 cards of a standard playing deck. Or maybe you're going to make a single sheet roll and write game that would use a single sheet of A4, a writing implement, and 1 or 2 dice. All of these component constraints immediately restrict the types of games you can make, and might really help you get through your game design block. Some other constraints might include constraining the number of players of the game. Maybe it's only going to be a 2-player game, or it might only be a solo game, and that will lead you to make different decisions. Or potentially you're going to constrain how long the game is going to be. Maybe it's only going to be a 10 or 15 minute game, which immediately tells you maybe I don't need a whole bunch of components. Maybe I don't have to worry about the game needing to be really balanced, because if the game's really short, well, you just shuffle up and go again. There's a whole bunch of other constraints you can use. In fact, that can be a way to even brainstorm new ideas. Just dream up new constraints and try and build a game around that. For example, you think of the constraint that you can never see the cards in your own hand, and that constraint led to games like Hanabi. Okay, so the next point in which game design block can rear its ugly head is in the middle of the design process. At this point you have a working prototype and you've worked out a lot of the game. Some of it is working and there is a core of fun there, but there are still large parts of the game that you're not certain about, whether you need to keep them, whether you need to change them, or maybe whether you need to design an entirely new aspect to improve the gameplay. The first tip I'd have at this point is to change your surroundings. For me personally, I've really learnt that when I need to solve somewhat foundational problems in design, or big problems, I need to get away from my computer. Basically, my rule is that no good game design decisions are made in front of a computer. I find if I'm stuck in front of a computer, I'm not particularly creative. I can't think a bit outside the box, and that's often what you need to solve these problems in the middle of the game design process. So my solution is to go for a walk. I pretty much go for a walk every day in the afternoon, usually for about an hour. Now I do it with our 1-year-old daughter. And for me, changing my surroundings just resets my brain a bit. It means I think in a different way. I'm moving, so that's keeping some part of my brain going, and I think it frees up your subconscious to do some thinking on that bigger design problem. Another place I find very useful is when I'm sitting on a train or a bus. Something about that movement is relaxing some part of me and allows me to make progress in other parts of my brain. And you might know particular surroundings that are really useful for you to think. And if you don't know, try some things. Go for a walk, go to a different room in your house. It's hard to accurately predict exactly what's going to lead to that design breakthrough. Changing things up can give you the best chance of it happening. But when thinking about the actual game itself, and a tip that might help with the actual details of how your game works or its mechanisms, is this idea of doubling or halving everything. When we're iterating a game design, it can be very tempting to change different parameters a very small amount from game to game, because we're pretty sure that things work and we don't want to throw out the bit of balance that we already have going on. But if you're only changing things a little bit, it can be really hard to make large amounts of progress in your game. I think about it in a way of a ball rolling down a hill. The ball is your game and you wanted to get to the bottom of the hill. The bottom of the hill is the resting point of that game. It's where it should be. It's where it's working its best. But as a ball is rolling down the hill, it might encounter a small little ditch or something where it gets stuck and it'll stop rolling down. And these ditches where your game design gets stuck, they're the kind of stable points of your design as you go through your design process. And when it's in that ditch, it can feel kind of like it's already at the bottom of the hill. Things have stopped moving, you don't feel this great need to change things are working well, but actually you're not at the bottom of the hill. And you need something to kick the ball out, to kick your game out of that ditch so it can keep rolling down the hill and finally get to the bottom of the hill where it should be. I hope that analogy made sense. But that kick requires a big change in your game. And one of the easiest ways you can make a big change, especially in games with lots of resources or numerical data, is just either by doubling particular components or halving them. So if players are drawing 2 cards every turn, let them draw 4 cards every turn. If a particular action costs 4 resources, maybe make it cost 2 resources. The good thing with the doubling or halving method is you'll see the effects of these changes really quickly. And really at this point, these changes are not about producing a better game, it's about giving you insights into the game you already have and the right decisions that you can make to improve it. So feel free to try some more radical things in that middle point to help break through that game design block, and you'll get really useful information that will help you move through that point. So, you've been working a game for a really long time and it's pretty much there, but you're not sure whether it's finished. You're wondering whether it's the time to start pitching the game, but you really think you should keep working on it. But it's really tough at this point. You've been working on the game for a long time. You might be a bit sick of it at this point. Your playtesters might be a bit sick of it as well. So how can you push through that final block at the very final stage of the game design process? At this point, you might be trying to make some very fine decisions. These final decisions between one of 2 very defined options, and you're not really sure which one might be the correct one. You've tried both out in tests, they feel about the same. You don't really know. One guideline I like to use is I know a solution is the right solution if it solves multiple problems at once. Not only often does this help streamline a design, I think it's a really good way of knowing if that decision you're going to make is the right one. This isn't always the case, and it's somewhat of a personal preference because I'll always aim to have a more streamlined and simple rule set if possible, but it can help you quantitatively compare different solutions that you might be thinking about using. And the other thing I would say about having game design block at the very end of the process is that it might not actually be game design block at all. It actually might be perfectionism or something like that. I think game designers, like a lot of creatives, find it really hard to know when to finish working on something. And as the saying goes, a game design is never really done, you just stop working on it. And so sometimes we think of these things as design problems or blocks that we have, but really it's our own perfectionism which is blocking us from just saying, actually, it's good enough to go, it's good enough to pitch to a publisher. If you have a game that you've been working on for a while, that your playtesters enjoy, that is in a stable point, but for some reason you haven't put it in front of a publisher, I would really encourage you now, go and email a publisher and pitch it to them if you can. Even if it's just one, it'll help break through this block that you have of perfectionism. The other part of this is I truly believe that the last 10% of a game design in some ways can only be done with a publisher. Those last few decisions really require you to know exactly the type of audience that the game is going to be made. And until you know who you're going to publish the game with, you don't really know who that audience is going to be. Each publisher has their own audience in mind and their own preferences for fine-tuning a game. So in terms of being efficient and not wasting time, it can be a good idea to wait until you have a publisher to work with to do that final fine-tuning. That's not to say not to try and make a game that functions very well before you pitch it, but there is this grey area where I like to leave a little bit not fully refined until I can work with the publisher to make those final changes. So those were some tips that I used to help get through game design block at the beginning, middle, and end of the game design process. Whether it's using constraints or only making enough components for one round to get you through that hurdle at the start of the process, to encouraging you to double or halving things in the middle of the game design process, or getting out and changing your surroundings to get better ideas, to giving you the confidence to know when your game design is done and ready to pitch at the end of the process. I hope that you've found one or two of these tips useful to you wherever you might be on your game design journey. If you've got any tips or tricks that have helped you break through game designer's block, leave them down in the comments below, and hopefully that can help someone else who might be stuck on their game. But until next time, thanks for watching, and all the best with your game designs. Bye!